So I just watched Lindsay Ellis's video on Game of Thrones, and I thought for sure she would address this, but she didn't. It's still a good video and you should give her channel some love, but I have not seen anyone, or at least not any channels big enough for me to notice, cover this topic, so I'm going to. Because it's my fucking channel, and if I want to subject you to my shower thoughts, so be it. So what's with the incredibly inflammatory title, Double D? Why are you making this video for no reason but your own desire to hear yourself talk? Isn't that what Twitter is for? And yes, I did do a Twitter thread about this at the time because I thought the idea was funny, but I figured someone, even casually, would have brought it up by now. But as I said, no, there hasn't been the case. I admit I haven't looked very hard, of course, just passive osmosis of channels I watch. So what sparked this title? Am I saying Game of Thrones is entirely about white supremacy? No, of course not, but I am suggesting that you really shouldn't expect much from a TV show run by men with such small imaginations. One of those channels I do follow is Game of Thrones Academy, who are probably in desperate need of a rebranding now. Their finale analysis of the series asked the question, why is the North the only state allowed to leave the Seven Kingdoms when at least two others, Dorne and the Iron Islands, who supported Daenerys and thus are inclined to be the most disenfranchised with the current state of affairs, don't even suggest secession? Well, as someone who has been watching the early seasons of the show on Rabbit during the final season, the answer to me was pretty obvious. See, some of you might remember a couple of years ago when Dan and Dave proposed their series Confederate, a show that would have explored the modern day if the Confederacy had won the war. You know, the fantasy world where white people have an advantaged station over black people. What a brainstorming journey that must have been. Well, going back to the early seasons, it's really hard to shake the idea, once you've thought of it, that to Dan and Dave, the North is the Confederacy. That's how they treat it. So follow me along this journey. The North is presented as sort of a heroic underdog, both in Martin's books and in the TV series. The North isn't perfect, but their values are typically based in loyalty, honor, and protecting the Seven Kingdoms from the ravages beyond the Wall. The North is the kingdom that respects the Night's Watch the most, because they are close to the action. But importantly, the show frames their war immediately as a feudal gesture of good people going against the all-powerful national government. Don't believe me?
It was the dragons we bowed to, and now the dragons are dead.
The Enterprise is automatically shown as doomed. I would posit that this equivalency the pair drew in their heads, intentionally or not, is why they emphasize Ser Gregor burning the Riverlands twice in the series in two separate occasions, while so many of the other details of the Stark's war with the Lannisters are barely even mentioned or thrown out of the series altogether. Gregor Clegane was their Sherman, lighting the farmlands on fire to wage total war on the poor, outgunned North. The North loses the War of the Five Kings in both versions, but in the books, there's an X factor at play in the North that Dan and Dave skipped over in the TV show. In the books, Stannis isn't marching directly on Winterfell yet because he is busy shoring up support for the Northern Lords. The war has left the North devastated, and while the Boltons have their view turned outward, dealing with the remnant Ironborn, politics in King's Landing, and the massive migration of wildlings from over the Wall, Stannis is busy solving the more practical problems, securing holdfasts, arbitrating disputes, and importantly, shoring up Ned Stark's old alliances. Stannis is actually dealing with some pushback from his new bannermen that they attack Winterfell immediately, before he thinks it's tactically sound to save the fake Arya Stark from the clutches of Ramsay Bolton. The loyalty that Ned inspired in others seems to be finally paying off as Book 6 opens, but of course it's impossible to know yet exactly how that plays out. As the characters often remind us, Ned Stark had many admirers, but they served him no practical value. But there does appear to be, in the books, a glimmer of hope that the seeds Ned Stark planted were not quick to bloom, but nigh impossible to uproot. Those of duty, loyalty, and honor do have a place in the long-term survival of his family's power structure, even if they did not help him in the moment. The show takes a much less nuanced view of this. In the show, the North is portrayed much more as a lost cause. Noble warriors going off to die, hopelessly outgunned, outnumbered, but not outfoxed. Robb Stark plays a part of Robert E. Lee, who was only finally beaten when he no longer physically had an army. Once the war is over, resistance to the Boltons does not exist. These are the bad people, or as they were known in Reconstruction, black people, who finally had political enfranchisement and started swinging their weight around. The most egalitarian time to be a black person in the South, where one could expect representation and their interests to be held in government, was the 1870s, and that only has competition with the election of 2018. Eventually, the North rises again, unlike the actual South, and again, upon their second independence, Dan and Dave show us that the lost cause myth is alive and well. Jon Snow is proclaimed king in the North because he is the son of Ned Stark. Immediately after, we are shown that is not true. This iteration is a lost cause in its own small way. This need of Dan and Dave to present the North not as a political faction, but the heroic political faction, is probably the hardest thing to unsee. They think it's the Confederacy. What has been torn to shreds in other places is how the actors of color were given a raw deal in the final seasons. Missandei is particularly bad with this. She has one major conversation with Grey Worm, which feels like it's his 2 days to retirement, but surprise, gotcha, it was her 2 days to retirement conversation. And beyond that, she only exists to tell the white characters how amazing Dany is. While the non-combatants are all huddled in the crypts and trying to keep each other's spirits up, Missandei only has one line about how they should all be grateful to the Dragon Queen. What a compelling and independent character we have there. And at the end of the series, Lady Hitler was given a crime. As Lindsay's video eloquently pointed out, but she failed to make the connection. Dany's crime was that she wanted slavery to end too much. She wanted to break too many chains. Again, none of this is wrong per se, but when we combine with the nostalgia they clearly feel in wanting to throw their weight around to recreate a modern-day slave America on screen, we kinda can't put that genie back in the bottle. Yeah, it's really hard to unsee that message, that Dany cared too much about the slaves and not enough about the status quo, as this being anything other than the Confederate States of Westeros. And of course, the happy ending, where all the brown people who came to Westeros go back to where they came from. Yeah, I'm not even making this up, it's just there in front of me. There is one element that I have to lay at George's feet here, not Dan and Dave's. And this is not me calling George a white supremacist or that his books secretly advocate white supremacy, but he, the man, does share one trait in common with white supremacist narratives that makes it a white supremacist wet dream. White people like Davis Orini or the Golden One cling to it like a hentai pillow. He doesn't think that migration happens. The world of Planetos, generally speaking, is held in a sort of ethnic homeostasis. Look at how static the bloodlines are. The Starks ruling Winterfell for 10,000 years. The Boltons ruling the Dreadfort for just as long. The Freys ruling the Twins for 600. You know who thinks ruling families and ethnic clusters work this way? Dumb white people. Dumb modern white people specifically, who say, well, I know who my grandfather was, and he must have known the same, so just keep going backwards and I basically have my ancestry figured out. People who think nations just sit in one place for thousands of years. There are some exceptions beyond the major migrations of the First Men and the Andals. House Manderley is one such example, one of the few northern families who worship the Seven, because what defines them is that centuries ago, to put it into modern terms, before the Magna Carta was signed, they were foreigners. Once. What defines these small examples we see in the books is how that label and tradition sticks. How there was never total assimilation for the people who basically look and speak the same. I was in Kevin Logan's channel for his response vid to 30 Questions for Globalists. You should check it out, plug for His Majesty, King of the SJWs. And Kevin mentioned that there were what we might consider black emperors. One example being Caracalla from the north of Africa. Several people in his chat stated, but North Africans aren't black. Leaving aside that that's certainly not true for all North Africans, Caracalla ruled nearly 1800 years ago. To claim because many people today wouldn't look dark-skinned would ignore the blending of the native ethnic groups. It could happen, like, say, if a group of Swedish people were to migrate to North Africa in the tens of thousands. This is just 2 centuries after Caracalla's reign. This isn't even counting the Goths, who had already migrated to the region, or the Arabs who would cross over with the Caliphate 300 years later, or... Look, you get the point. Whether or not we'd call Caracalla black is immaterial to the point that people just look at a modern map and assume that's where the borders always go. Again, this isn't to say A Song of Ice and Fire is a dog whistle or something, just that the same very uncritical view of genetics and race theory is at play. And I think very uncritical people of those ideas, see dumb white people, are drawn to the similarity they've constructed of their own history. Which is why Dan and Dave loved Game of Thrones so much, at least in part. They saw race theory that they loved and wanted to make real. And mind, George might still avert this by showing us the rebuilding of the, quote, ancient families in Westeros, much like we saw with Gendry in the TV show, but on a massive scale. The line is sort of unbroken, but that line is definitely dotted repeatedly throughout history, and the Maesters just politely ignore the inconsistency. Dan and Dave definitely didn't do that. So there you have it, my 2 cents. This is obviously not a serious video, but hopefully I've ruined Game of Thrones for you forever, beyond what Dan and Dave did. Now you too will never be able to watch the good seasons without seeing the Confederate States of
the North!
My work continues.